We heard from President Zimmer, we heard from Lars, and Michael spoke about the future of BFI. And now I wanted to take this time to shine a spotlight on, particularly the interdisciplinary nature of this university, which I think really defines us as a university. And we have a group of faculty here at the university who, while they hail from various academic disciplines within our institution, they're all uniquely engaged in and with China through their research. So when we think about the university's engagement with China, it's not merely an exchange of students or a diplomatic effort. It is a deep programmatic and research engagement that actually the university does, which helps us connect more deeply with China. So the way we'll work this is today's panelists, I will say a few words about each of them, and then they will each give a brief introduction to their work, followed by a few questions which I'll ask of them, and then we'll throw it open to everybody else for some questions. So let me introduce you to our panelists. Let me start with Ben Zhao. He's a professor of computer science. Our computer science department has been growing explosively, and he's part of that growth. He's joined us recently from Santa Barbara. He has his PhD from Berkeley and did undergraduate work at Yale. But before that, he was born in Beijing, where he lived till he was 10 years old. Yeah. His research focuses on empirical data-driven perspectives on computer security, machine learning, and HCI. He has worked not only in an academic setting, but also in a more impactful industry-facing setting with a bunch of Chinese institutions and several Chinese companies such as Microsoft Research Asia, Huawei, Renren, and now has new collaborations with Ping An and Alibaba. And I guess what he finds most exciting about China is the open embrace of new research and technology. Turning then to Zhao Yingming, who is our professor in the Biological Sciences Department and in Cancer Research, and has been at the university for 9 years, and is a leading authority on the studies of proteomics and epigenetics, two biomedical disciplines that can assist us to understand diseases at a very small molecular level. While genomics is the study of genes in an organism, proteomics goes one step deeper and studies the level of the protein in each cell. And these studies are particularly beneficial because proteins are the functional molecules in cells, and they represent actual conditions. He got his PhD from Rockefeller University and is also a co-founder and scientific advisor for a number of biotech and pharma companies. And lastly, I introduce you to Professor Chang-Tai Hsieh, who's a professor in economics here at the Booth School of Business, and also a co-director of BFI's Development Economics Initiative. He's been at the university since 2012 and received his PhD from Berkeley and his BA from Swarthmore. His research focuses on understanding Chinese institutions, the way they interact with the economy, and how they affect growth. Understanding the importance of access to data, he has helped develop partnerships with CUHK in Hong Kong, as well as Tsinghua in Beijing, to develop a central clearinghouse of historical and real-time economic data that can be used by researchers, policymakers in China to better understand a variety of economic issues. So let me get back to Ben. Maybe he can say a few words about his work, and then perhaps I can ask him a few questions. And we'll move that way across everybody and then open it up to general questions.
Sure. Really happy to be here to see everyone. So broadly speaking, my research is a sort of empirical data-driven aspect or perspective on artificial intelligence and machine learning with the security angle. I think one of the big sort of problems or challenges that we face in artificial intelligence is the non-transparency of some of the neural learning models, particularly with deep learning. And so there's a lot of raw power that we have in some of these tools, and they're being rapidly adopted by countries around the world and all sorts of applications, from cancer research to security and facial recognition and traffic management and so on. The problem is that when these models go bad, we don't quite understand. And so there is a great sort of possibility of risk moving forward with either intentional malice attacks or inadvertent bugs in these sort of models. So a lot of what I'm looking at is sort of fundamental methods to mathematically and in practice to understand and to test these models so that we can understand with some level of certainty when they work, when they fail, and what their limitations are. So I sort of apply that, and we have a bunch of applications across a lot of different security domains.
Yeah. So that's really interesting, and it's also really topical, right? Because of what's happening right now with data. People often wonder, your work, does that translate into what an individual can do to protect themselves with ML algorithms gone awry?
That's a very sort of a long potential answer there, but I'll try to be brief. I mean, broadly speaking, machine learning used badly can have a lot of negative consequences across the board. So whether it's attackers who can manipulate content so that we can essentially have really advanced versions of fake news that manipulate media, or it's personalized attacks, forged videos that of you or I doing things that we never actually did in real life. A lot of these potential attacks are quite fundamental. There's not a whole lot that we can, as individuals, do right now, which is part of the risk. And so a lot of what we're trying to do is try to race ahead of the attackers to try to develop fundamental methods that will allow us to secure and prevent these types of attacks before they really become commonplace.
Right. And let me shift tacks from the technical and ask you a question about your perspective. Both Yingming and Chang-Tai have been here for a while. You came here recently from Santa Barbara. It's a different place.
Yeah.
University of Chicago with this interdisciplinary approach. Can you share with us a perspective, and also for all our audience here, in terms of what you see as someone who just got here recently and what's unique about the way we do things here?
It's I'm still absorbing sort of what it means to be at University of Chicago. It's an immersive experience. It's sort of overwhelming in some respects. The intellectual powerhouse that pervades every single department and every single professional school. So I think just the rigor, the intense focus on intellectual pursuit, I think is unmatched by any other institution that I've known and experienced. And so it's quite special. The students here, the uncanny focus of the faculty and the administrators, but also the students themselves on focus on academics and intellectual pursuit. It's really impressive. Many other schools will lay claim to similar kind of things, but I think this is lived out here and in practice much more than I've ever seen in another institution.
Right. And so thinking back to the last 2 decades, the computer science department here has been kind of a proxy math department, and that's changing dramatically with your advent and a few other people. Can you just speak a little bit about in what areas we are focusing at the moment?
Yeah, so I think, in some sense, the computer science department has been a theoretical powerhouse for many decades. And so, on the other hand, there's been less of a focus on sort of data-driven applications and connections to a lot of the schools and other departments at the university. And so that sort of is an opportunity that we're now starting to address. So with myself and quite a number of other hires who are coming in the areas of data, security, systems, machine learning, we're really being able to now finally build all these bridges that have sort of more or less been laying waiting for quite some time. So one thing that amazes me on a daily basis is how many different people I meet from different departments and schools across the campus who are intensely interested in sort of building collaborative efforts in data sciences, in data initiatives across a variety of disciplines. So that's one of the most exciting things right now.
Wonderful. Well, thanks a lot. Moving on to Yingming. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about your work and your research, and maybe we can speak a little bit about some of those details.
Thanks. 大家好. I'm delighted to be here. So I'm Yingming Zhao from medical school. We are interested in developing and using a relatively new technology called proteomics for systematic examining changes of proteins in tissues or in blood or in cells. We hope we can use this technology to identify protein-based indicators for disease diagnosis and for predicting drug response. So in the past few decades, tremendous progress has been made. Nevertheless, we still have a limited understanding of diseases such as cancer. So therefore, it's critical for us to have better understand diverse diseases at the molecular level, or more specifically at the protein level. So the question is, why a protein instead of genes? So a gene needs to produce its end product, protein, to exercise its function. So a cell or a tissue's function is largely determined by collective effort of all the protein in the cell. So if we don't understand disease at the protein level, we only get a very small portion of the information which is associated with disease. A problem or a dysregulation of proteins can lead to diseases such as cancer. So how do we address this problem? So we use mainly proteomic technology that enable us to quantify change of proteins in tissues or in blood. So we can compare proteins between normal individuals and the patient. In such a way, we can identify those proteins which are indicate for disease or that can respond to drug treatment. So we hope this kind of technology can develop better way for diagnosis and for predicting drug response.
So I'm just trying to think, in the world of genomics, there's a lot of connectivity already between the fundamental science and new companies that are coming with actual products.
Yeah.
How can you talk a little bit about that and how far this protein level analysis is from, being something that can then graduate into the commercial sphere?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question. So genomics is very powerful, and so genomics approach already developed diverse diagnostic tools, especially for cancer. So nevertheless, only 4% of diseases has association with genetic mutation. Only 4%.
4%?
Yeah.
Right.
So based on existing literature. So therefore, 96% of diseases has no association with genetic mutation, most of which are likely associated with protein changes. So protein-based diagnosis is not new. Actually, pregnancy test is based on protein change in the blood.
Of course, yeah.
So therefore, scientifically, it's impossible to argue against the existence of a protein-based biomarker for disease diagnosis. So my personal bet is in the next decade, there will be dozens of new diagnostic tools which are based on protein biomarkers, which will be discovered by proteomic tools.
And with that new diagnostics tools, you're expecting that to fit into drug discovery as well?
Absolutely, absolutely. So in the pharmaceutical industry, there are two major bottlenecks. One is to identify protein-based target for drug. The other one is patient classification. So some drugs are only beneficial for a small group of patients, even for the same cancer, so for the same type of cancer. So I think nowadays there's a new term called precision medicine.
Yes.
Precision medicine will have great future in the next few decades. So if we want to materialize precision medicine, we should have a precision diagnosis, a precision drug. So these are all depending on what we understand of disease at the protein level.
Right. That is That is fascinating. Ever since we met, I found this really an incredibly interesting set of possibilities that I can just begin to barely imagine. We'll move on to Professor Chang-Tai now. Maybe you can say a little bit about your work and the work you've been doing on the ground in China, and then maybe you can speak a little bit about it.
Sure, of course. So I'm a professor at the Booth School of Business. So broadly, I work on how companies innovate, what are the sources of innovation, and what kinds of institutional features of the business environment, broadly speaking, help in that process, and what features detract from that process. So I work some on China, which I'll talk about, some on India, do a fair amount of work on companies, or what companies do in Latin America as well, and also some work in the US. In terms of China, I thought it would be helpful if I just illustrate what I think is both the biggest opportunity and also the biggest challenge that Chinese businesses and the Chinese environment face by asking you two questions that I'm sure you know the answer to. Number one, okay, when you get off the plane in Beijing and you go to the taxi line, okay, what brand are the taxis? I'm sure you all know the answer to the question. So what brand are the taxis when you get out of the airport in Beijing? Does somebody know? They're all Hyundais, right? There's a Hyundai, and I don't know whether you've ever asked yourself the question, why? You get off the plane in Shanghai, what brand are the taxis? They're not Hyundais. They're all Volkswagen. And do you know why? I'm sure you all know the reason why. They're all joint ventures with the local, and that basically, I think, captures the story of what I think is the key institutional feature supporting private businesses in China, that the key institution is what local governments do. And I'm sure that somewhere in the audience here, there are representatives from the local, they are represented. That's been the key driver in the last 20 or 25 years. So I would say that's both the key opportunity and the key, that's really, I think, where China has been incredibly innovative. What Chinese local governments do in the last 25 or so years, I've not seen anywhere else in the world that they do. But that also poses, I think, the biggest challenge on basically, if, just think, what are the challenges that you face when you want to grow a major business, but your major source of institutional support is the local government, okay? And I'm going to put it broadly as being, you want to think about it as being, one way to summarize what I think is the Chinese regime is that it's a regime where support is based on discretion by local government officials, and then the alternative system you may want to think about is a system that's based on rules. So think about rules versus discretion. Okay, and I'll just say, just shifting a bit, a big part of what we've been doing at Booth is to understand this institutional feature, understand how it affects what businesses do, and also building up the data infrastructure that in which we can have some information about what companies are doing, what are both the benefits and also the potential risks in this kind of an institutional system. So I'll just end by just saying two things. One, there's been in the last 8 years or so, there's been major changes in the Chinese financial system. Huge, enormous changes. My colleague who I see there, He Ziguo, has been doing work on this. The work that I have done has been about looking at the development of the local financing vehicles of the local government that started in about 2008 or 2009, and the kind of and how they have transformed after the end of the fiscal stimulus. In terms of the building of the data infrastructure, we have built up partnerships with basically three main sources. One, we now have a partnership along with Tsinghua University, with China's National Bureau of Statistics to basically gather better data on what the state of the what the state of the economy is. So the status of that is that there's now a data center that sits at Tsinghua University, where through secure servers we have access to all of the official data. There's a protocol that one has to go through in order to do this. We have a partnership with China's State Administration of Industry and Commerce, and the main advantage of that is that we can look at ownership data. So we can figure out who owns whom and what are the links between companies. So we can answer questions like somebody mentioned that Professor Zhao was doing work with the Ping An Insurance. We can answer the question of who really is the owner of Ping An Insurance. I don't know whether Ben, but I can tell you the answer to that. And the third thing that we have done is that we built up partnerships with private Chinese companies who have been behind, who have lots of data, big data, and we were working with some of them to both better use their data and to interpret the data and to help them use the data so that they can do better things in the future. So it's both, understanding the institutional regime and also just bringing data and using data better.
We've spoken about this before, but perhaps this is the good. In this audience, we have a bunch of powerful CEOs from all across China. Can you speak a little bit about the challenges of actually establishing partnerships and what those potential partners think about the benefits to them, the benefits to us as well, are more clear from what you already said?
Well, the benefit lots of Chinese companies have been at the forefront of gathering data, gathering data.
In the normal course of business.
In just the normal course of business. So I'll give you one example. One of the companies that we've been working with is this company called G7, which is this trucking company. It's a trucking company, and and what they have is that they have incredible data on the flow of trucks, on the flow of trucks from different cities. So you can begin to get a better sense of how businesses are conducting transactions between different are conducting transactions between different markets. Another company that we've been collaborating is this wealth management company called Yi. So we have data on basically, so it's basically a company that provides sovereign wealth products, overseas wealth products, so we can get a better picture on something that we think is potentially important on the outflow of funds from China. So we can get a better sense of what the flows are of capital. So that's in terms to the private business. But I think the bigger thing, I think it's important to not only think about your business, but to also think about the broader institutional environment. Because that is ultimately what matters more for the success of the economy as a whole.
Right. And what about the first part of my question? What are the challenges on actually establishing a new partnership like this for a university like ours, who while working on the ground in China is still a university from the United States?
Well, I guess the major challenge that I have faced is really the issue of trust. Is the issue of trust, but that just comes, that's true of everything. It's a little bit more challenging in the case of China because of the absence of the typical institutional infrastructure. You can't just sign a contract, right? You can't just sign a contract because it's difficult to enforce a contract. I mean that's maybe one way in which you want to think about it. So if you want contract enforcement, you got to figure out another way of doing it. Figure out. So that's been the main thing. So in terms of this agreement with the National Bureau of Statistics, it's taken us 10 years to do it. And I guess part of the reason is that every time we had an agreement with the National Bureau of Statistics, the next week the director of the National Bureau of Statistics went to jail. So that happened twice to us.
Was it causal?
What?
Was it causal?
I was afraid that it was causal. So that happened to us. That happened to us twice. But this time it didn't happen.
And before I throw it open to questions, you and I have spoken about this before, but maybe you can just speak a little bit for this audience about the different aspects of innovation in companies between India and China with the notion of jugaad in India and what you're observing in China.
So if you go and spend any time in India, Indian businessmen, they have this fabulous term. They have this fabulous term which they call jugaad. Okay, so next time you're on your computer, look up that word, I'm sure there are different ways of spelling it. And if you talk with Indian businessmen, what they mean by that is that a lot of what they spend their time doing is they improvise. Okay, they figure out a way to get around the rules. Okay, because they've learned that if you go and you complain about the rules or you try to lobby against the rules, that typically doesn't work. That typically doesn't work. So then they improvise or they do a workaround around the rules, and so they will talk proudly about how they are really good at doing jugaad. Okay. One way I think about China is that it's really that story of doing jugaad. I don't know. I've never heard of a Chinese term for that. But I think about it as jugaad on steroids. That it's basically finding a workaround around the rules, but with an intensity that an Indian businessman can only dream of. And that goes back to my first point about the role of local governments. The role of local governments is to basically make doing jugaad as easy as possible. And that's where the discretion becomes important, because you need their discretion to do jugaad jugaad. So it's so much part of the system that it becomes almost part of the formal institutional environment. And that is perhaps where I see it. And so the one way in which I would summarize it is that Indian businessmen do jugaad on the small scale, do jugaad for the little things, and then successful Chinese businesses do jugaad on a massive scale. And it's been impressive what has been accomplished.